Case 1. Claude Jones was executed on December 7, 2000 for the 1989 killing of Alan Hilzendager, a liquor store owner in Point Blank, Texas. From the day of his arrest until his final hours, Claude Jones maintained that the state had made a serious mistake. He said he was not present during the murder and did not take part in the robbery. Despite his claims, Texas carried out the execution. Years later, scientific testing raised strong doubts about the evidence that helped put him on death row. Claude Jones was arrested along with Leonel Herrera, who was accused of being the gunman in the robbery. Prosecutors argued that Claude helped plan the crime and acted as a lookout. The case against him did not rely on eyewitnesses who clearly placed him at the scene. Instead, it depended heavily on forensic evidence and statements from others who were trying to avoid trouble themselves. One of the most important pieces of physical evidence was a single hair fragment found on the victim's shirt. At trial, a forensic analyst told the jury that the hair was consistent with Claude Jones. This claim made the hair seem like a strong link between Claude and the crime. At the time, DNA testing was not performed on the hair, even though such testing could have provided clear answers. Claude Jones was convicted and sentenced to death. As he entered death row, he continued to ask for DNA testing on the hair evidence. His lawyers argued that modern science could show whether the hair truly belonged to him. These requests were raised during appeals and clemency efforts. Even so, the courts did not order testing before the execution. The final decision was made without the science being utilized. On the evening of December 7, 2000, Claude Jones was executed by lethal injection. His last statements repeated his claim of innocence and his frustration that the evidence had never been fully tested. After Claude Jones was already dead, DNA testing was finally conducted on the hair that had played such a major role in his conviction. The results were clear and disturbing. The hair did not belong to Claude Jones. Instead, the DNA showed that the hair came from the victim himself, Alan Hilzendager. This meant the prosecution's main physical evidence linking Claude to the crime was wrong. The jury had been told the hair pointed to Claude, but science later disproved that claim. By the time this information became public, there was no courtroom left for Claude Jones to return to. The execution could not be reversed. This discovery caused renewed attention to Claude Jones's case and to the wider issue of capital punishment. At the time of his trial, jurors trusted the expert testimony placed before them. They had no way of knowing that the forensic conclusion would later be disproven. Claude Jones did not receive the benefit of improved testing methods that are now common in criminal cases. His execution closed the door on any chance for a new trial or a full review based on accurate science. Before we proceed to the next case, if you enjoy watching true crime videos, this is the right channel for you. I post interesting videos on the channel daily. Please support my channel by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much. Case 2. Cameron Todd Willingham's name became one of the most debated in American death penalty history. He was executed by the state of Texas on February 17, 2004, after being convicted of killing his 3 young daughters in a house fire. From the moment he was accused until the moment of his death, Cameron Todd Willingham said one clear thing. He did not set the fire. He said the fire was an accident. He said he loved his children. His words never changed, even as his execution date grew closer. The fire happened on December 23, 1991, inside the small family home. Cameron's daughters, Amber, Carmen, and Cameron, were all very young. When the fire started, Cameron escaped through a window and tried to get back inside to save the girls. He suffered burns on his arms and scalp. Neighbors later spoke about seeing him outside the home, yelling for help. Firefighters arrived, but the flames were too strong. All 3 children died from smoke and fire injuries. What began as a terrible family tragedy soon turned into a criminal case. Fire investigators examined the burned house and concluded the fire was set on purpose. They focused on burn marks on the floor, cracks in the windows, and fire patterns that they believed showed the use of a liquid fuel. Based on these claims, Cameron Todd Willingham was arrested and charged with capital murder. In 1992, prosecutors presented this fire evidence to a jury. They argued that Cameron had poured an accelerant inside the house and started the fire to kill his children. The jury believed the testimony and found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. At the time of the trial, the fire investigation methods used were widely accepted in courtrooms across the United States. Many jurors had no reason to doubt the experts who spoke with confidence. Cameron continued to say he was innocent while sitting on death row. Over the years, he wrote letters and poems and told supporters that the fire was never set by him. Still, his appeals were denied, and his execution date remained in place. Years later, major doubts began to surface. Fire science had changed. New research showed that many signs once believed to prove arson could also happen in accidental house fires. A well-known fire scientist named Gerald Hurst reviewed the Willingham case before the execution. He concluded that the original investigation relied on old beliefs that were no longer supported by science. He explained that cracked glass, floor burn patterns, and fast-moving flames can occur naturally when a room becomes very hot. Hurst sent his findings to Texas officials, warning that the evidence did not prove arson. Despite this warning, Cameron Todd Willingham was executed in 2004. He was 40 years old. He walked into the execution chamber, still saying he did not kill his children. His case did not end with his death. Instead, the questions grew louder. In 2009, the Texas Forensic Science Commission reviewed the case. The commission examined how the fire was investigated and how conclusions were reached. Its findings were serious. The commission stated that the original fire investigation used methods that were not based on reliable science. The report explained that investigators relied on outdated ideas rather than tested principles. This meant the key evidence used to convict Cameron Todd Willingham was deeply flawed. The commission did not declare Cameron legally innocent. Courts never overturned his conviction. However, the commission did confirm that the fire science used against him was unreliable. Journalists and legal experts continued to study the case. In 2009, writer David Grann published a detailed investigation in The New Yorker, explaining how modern fire experts rejected the original arson findings. The Innocence Project also highlighted the case as an example of how faulty forensic science can lead to wrongful convictions. National reports on forensic evidence later confirmed that many techniques used in past trials lacked proper testing. Case 3. Liddell Lee said again and again that he did not commit the crime. From the first days of his arrest until the final moments of his life, Liddell Lee said the same thing. He said the state had made a terrible mistake. He said he was innocent. He believed that science could help show the truth if the courts would allow it. Liddell Lee was convicted for the 1993 killing of Deborah Reese, a woman who lived in Jacksonville, Arkansas. Deborah Reese was found badly beaten inside her home. The crime shocked the local community. Police investigated quickly, and Liddell Lee became a suspect. Prosecutors said Lee was responsible for the attack. A jury later found him guilty and sentenced him to death. From that point forward, his life moved inside prison walls, where he spent more than 2 decades waiting for execution. During his trial and later appeals, Lee's lawyers raised serious concerns about the evidence used against him. There was no DNA evidence presented at trial that clearly connected Liddell Lee to the crime. The case relied heavily on witness statements and other forms of proof that his defense said were weak and unreliable. Lee said this evidence did not show the full story. He said important testing was never done. He said items collected from the crime scene could hold answers. As time passed, DNA testing became much better than it had been in the early 1990s. Liddell Lee saw hope in this progress. He formally asked the courts to allow DNA testing on evidence from the crime scene, including items that had never been fully tested using modern methods. He believed this testing could show that someone else committed the crime. He did not ask for a pardon. He asked for proof. He wanted the chance to show the truth while he was still alive. These requests became more urgent in 2017. Arkansas announced plans to carry out several executions in a short period of time. The state said it wanted to move forward before its lethal injection drugs expired. Liddell Lee was placed on this schedule. His execution date was set for April 20, 2017. His lawyers rushed back to court, asking judges to pause the execution so DNA testing could happen first. They argued that killing a man without allowing this testing could lead to a terrible and permanent mistake. The courts denied his final requests. Judges ruled that the state was not required to allow DNA testing before the execution. This decision ended Liddell Lee's last legal options. On the evening of April 20, 2017, Liddell Lee was executed by lethal injection. In his final statement, he said he was innocent. He said he was not the person who killed Deborah Reese. He said the state was taking the life of the wrong man. After his death, the case did not fade away. Lee's family and legal supporters continued to push for DNA testing. Years later, courts allowed testing on some of the evidence from the crime scene. The results became public and drew national attention. The DNA found on key items did not match Liddell Lee. Instead, it pointed to an unknown male. While this testing did not legally clear Lee's name, it strengthened long-standing doubts about his conviction and raised painful questions about what might have been discovered if testing had been allowed earlier. If you found this video interesting so far, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for your support. Case 4. Marion Bowman Jr. was a man from South Carolina who was executed by the state on January 31, 2025. Even though he said until his final moments that he did not kill Candy Martin. He was 44 years old when he died. Marion Bowman Jr. had spent more than 20 years on death row, holding on to the same message every time he spoke. He said the wrong person was punished. Candy Martin was 21 years old when she was killed in 2001 in Dorchester County, South Carolina. She was found shot and her car was later discovered burned. The crime shocked the local community, and police moved quickly to find a suspect. Marion Bowman Jr. was arrested and charged. From the very start, he denied any involvement. He said he did not know Candy Martin well and said he was not at the scene when she was killed. Even so, prosecutors moved forward with the case against him. At trial in 2002, the case against Marion Bowman Jr. relied heavily on witness testimony. There was no DNA evidence presented that directly placed him at the crime scene. Years later, his supporters pointed out that some witnesses changed parts of their stories over time. Others said they felt pressured during questioning. Bowman's legal team later argued that this testimony should not have been trusted without stronger proof. Despite these concerns, the jury found Marion Bowman Jr. guilty, and he was sentenced to death. After his conviction, Marion Bowman Jr. entered the long and difficult appeals process. He challenged his sentence in state courts and federal courts. A major part of his argument focused on ineffective legal help during his original trial. His later attorneys said his first lawyer failed to investigate important leads, failed to challenge key testimony properly, and failed to present evidence that could have helped the jury see the case differently. Bowman also claimed that prosecutors did not fully share information that could have helped his defense. Each time, courts reviewed the claims and rejected them. As the years passed, Marion Bowman Jr. remained on death row. He lived under strict conditions, waiting while his legal team filed one appeal after another. During this time, he continued to say he was innocent. He spoke in interviews, wrote statements, and talked to people who visited him. His story never changed. He said the system had made a serious mistake and that his execution would take the life of a man who did not commit the crime. In the final months before his execution, Marion Bowman Jr.'s lawyers made last efforts to stop the sentence. They again raised concerns about witness reliability and the quality of his legal defense at trial. These requests reached the highest courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, but every request was denied. South Carolina officials are prepared to execute as scheduled. On the day of his execution, Marion Bowman Jr. chose lethal injection as the method of death, which was allowed under South Carolina law. In his final statement, he told the world once more that he was innocent. He said he was dying for a crime he did not commit. Witnesses reported that he remained calm and firm in his words. When the execution was carried out, the case officially came to an end in the eyes of the law. After his death, Marion Bowman Jr.'s case continued to spark strong reactions. Some people said the courts had carefully reviewed the case and reached the correct decision. Others said the lack of physical evidence and the questions about witness testimony should have stopped the execution. Case 5. Ellis Wayne Felker was executed by the state of Georgia on November 15, 1996, after spending many years on death row while saying he did not commit the crime. He was convicted for the 1981 rape and murder of Evelyn Joy Ludlam, a 24-year-old woman found dead in her home in Houston County, Georgia. From the moment police focused on him, through trial, appeals, and his final hours, Ellis Wayne Felker repeated one clear message: he was innocent. The crime that led to Felker's arrest shocked the local community. Evelyn Joy Ludlam was found strangled in her bedroom. The case deeply troubled investigators and residents because of the violence involved and the lack of witnesses. When Ellis Wayne Felker became the main suspect, the case against him relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. There was no clear physical proof that directly placed him at the scene at the exact moment of the killing. No murder weapon was recovered. No clear fingerprint evidence tied him to the act. Still, prosecutors argued that pieces of evidence, when viewed together, pointed to Felker. At trial, Felker's defense challenged the strength of the state's case. His lawyers said the evidence left room for doubt and did not meet the highest level of certainty required for a death sentence. Felker himself took the stand and denied killing Ludlam. Despite these arguments, a jury found him guilty and he was sentenced to death. Appeals followed for years, moving through state and federal courts. Each time, his conviction and sentence were upheld. As Ellis Wayne Felker waited on death row, new tools were beginning to change how old cases were reviewed. DNA testing was becoming more reliable and was helping uncover wrongful convictions across the United States. Felker asked for testing on items collected from the crime scene, believing science could support his claim of innocence. These requests were denied while he was still alive. Courts ruled that the evidence and procedures used during his trial were sufficient under the law at the time. On the day of his execution, Ellis Wayne Felker was put to death in Georgia's electric chair. He died still saying he did not kill Evelyn Joy Ludlam. His execution closed the legal case, but it did not end public questions. For many people, the lack of modern testing before his death remained troubling. Several years after Felker was executed, something rare happened. In 2000, a group of major news organizations pushed for post-execution DNA testing of evidence from the case. This was one of the first times such testing was allowed after a person had already been executed. The goal was simple: to learn whether science could confirm guilt or raise serious doubt. The testing results did not deliver a clear answer. Some evidence had been damaged by time. Other items could not provide strong DNA profiles. The results were described as inconclusive. They did not prove that Ellis Wayne Felker was innocent. They also did not firmly prove that he was guilty. Instead, the tests left the case in a painful middle space where certainty was impossible. Case 6. Ruben Cantu, only 17 years old when the crime happened. He was 26 years old when the state of Texas executed him. From the start of his case until his final day, Ruben Cantu said the same thing. He said he was innocent. Years after his execution, new information caused many people to question whether Texas had executed the wrong person. Ruben Cantu was convicted for the 1984 shooting death of Pedro Gomez in San Antonio, Texas. Pedro Gomez was a delivery driver who was attacked while working. During the crime, another teenage delivery worker was also shot and seriously injured, but survived. Police said the attack happened during a robbery. Ruben Cantu was later arrested and charged. The case moved quickly, and prosecutors said he was one of the attackers. The evidence used against Ruben Cantu was thin. There was no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, and no physical proof that placed him at the scene. The case depended mostly on one eyewitness, the teenage survivor who had been shot. At the time, the witness identified Ruben Cantu as the gunman. This identification became the center of the trial. A jury believed the testimony and convicted Ruben Cantu. He was sentenced to death. From the beginning, Ruben Cantu said the witness was wrong. He said he was not present during the crime. His lawyers argued that police focused on him too quickly and failed to fully investigate other possible suspects. They said the witness was young, injured, and under extreme stress when questioned. They also said the witness changed parts of his story over time. Despite these concerns, the conviction stood. Ruben Cantu spent years on death row. As time passed, his appeals were denied one by one. His case did not receive much attention outside Texas. There were no large protests. There was no major media focus at the time. The system moved forward quietly. On August 24, 1993, the state of Texas executed Ruben Cantu by lethal injection. He was one of the youngest people executed in the modern era of the state. He died still saying he did not kill Pedro Gomez. For many years, the case seemed finished. Ruben Cantu was gone, and the courts considered the matter closed. But more than a decade later, the story returned powerfully. In 2006, the Houston Chronicle published a detailed investigation into Ruben Cantu's case. What came out shocked many people who read it. The most important new information came from the sole eyewitness. Now an adult, the witness said something very different from what he said as a teenager. He said he no longer believed Ruben Cantu was the shooter. He explained that he had doubts even during the trial, but felt scared and pressured. He said police influence and fear played a role in his testimony. He said he did not feel free to speak up at the time. The investigation also raised questions about the police work in the case. Reports showed that another possible suspect was never fully pursued. Some leads were not followed. Important questions were left unanswered. Legal experts began to review the case more closely. Innocence advocates started to say openly that Ruben Cantu may have been innocent. Because Ruben Cantu had already been executed, there was no trial to reopen and no chance for a new jury to hear the doubts. There was also no way to test physical evidence using modern science because the case did not rely on such evidence in the first place. This made the situation even more painful. The questions came too late to save his life. Case 7. Carlos de Luna went to his death while saying again and again that he did not kill anyone. He was executed for the stabbing death of Wanda Lopez, a 24-year-old gas station clerk in Corpus Christi. From the moment police arrested him in February 1983, Carlos de Luna said the same thing. He was not the killer. He told officers that another man committed the crime. That man, he said, was named Carlos Hernandez. The courts did not accept this claim. Years later, many legal scholars and innocence advocates would say his words deserved far more attention than they received. The crime happened on February 4, 1983, at a Shamrock gas station in Corpus Christi. Wanda Lopez was working alone when she was attacked and stabbed. She died shortly after being taken to the hospital. Police began searching the area and arrested Carlos de Luna several hours later, about a mile from the gas station. He had been drinking. He was confused and frightened. Importantly, he did not have a knife on him. The knife used to kill Wanda Lopez was never found. There was also no physical evidence, such as fingerprints or DNA, that directly linked Carlos de Luna to the murder. The case against Carlos de Luna relied mostly on circumstantial evidence and eyewitness descriptions. Some witnesses said the attacker looked like de Luna, but no one clearly saw the stabbing itself. The descriptions were brief and given under stress. Carlos de Luna admitted he had been nearby, but he denied hurting anyone. He told police that Carlos Hernandez, a man he knew, was violent and often carried a knife. At trial, this claim was treated as an excuse rather than a serious lead. Hernandez was barely investigated. The jury never heard a full picture of who Hernandez was or what he had done in the past. Carlos de Luna's defense was weak and underfunded. His lawyers did not deeply investigate Hernandez. They did not present strong evidence to support de Luna's claim that another man was responsible. As a result, the jury heard a simple story. Carlos de Luna was nearby. He looked like the suspect, and he must have done it. In 1983, the jury convicted him of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. From that point on, Carlos de Luna entered the long and frightening wait on death row. While on death row, Carlos de Luna did not change his story. He told his lawyers, reporters, and prison officials that he was innocent. His appeals were denied. Clemency requests failed. The state moved forward. On December 7, 1989, Texas executed Carlos de Luna by lethal injection. In his final statement, he expressed love for his family and asked forgiveness from Wanda Lopez's family while still saying he did not commit the crime. For many years, the case seemed closed. Carlos de Luna was gone, and the courts had moved on. However, the story did not end there. In 2012, a team of lawyers, investigators, and law students published a massive report in the Columbia Human Rights Law Review titled Los Tocayos Carlos, Anatomy of a Wrongful Execution. The investigation took years. It examined police records, court files, witness statements, and criminal histories that were never fully explored during the trial. The investigation found that Carlos Hernandez was a real person, not a made-up name. He lived near the crime scene. He looked very similar to Carlos de Luna. He had a long record of violence, often involving knives. Multiple people said Hernandez regularly carried a knife. Some witnesses later stated that Hernandez had bragged about killing a woman at a gas station. Details he shared matched parts of the crime that were not widely known at the time. None of this information was presented to the jury that sentenced Carlos de Luna to death. The Columbia investigation concluded that the wrong man was likely executed. While Texas courts have never formally declared Carlos de Luna innocent, the findings raised serious doubts about the conviction. Legal experts pointed out that the case lacked solid evidence and that another strong suspect was ignored. Because Carlos de Luna was already executed, there was no way for a new trial to take place. There was no courtroom where these findings could be tested in a fair hearing. Case 8. Troy Anthony Davis. From the very beginning of his case until his final words, Troy Davis said clearly and calmly that he was innocent. As he faced death, he spoke one last time and said, "I am innocent. The incident that happened that night was not my fault. I did not have a gun that night. I did not shoot your family member." Those words became part of one of the most discussed death penalty cases in modern American history. The story began on August 19, 1989, in Savannah, Georgia. That night, Officer Mark Allen McPhail, a police officer working off duty, rushed to help a homeless man who was being attacked in a parking lot near a bus station. During that moment, Officer McPhail was shot and killed. The city was shaken. A police officer had died while trying to help someone else. There was strong public pressure to find the person responsible as quickly as possible. Troy Davis was arrested and charged with the murder. From the start, the case against him had serious gaps. There was no murder weapon found that belonged to him. There was no DNA evidence linking him to the shooting. No fingerprints were tying him to the crime scene. Prosecutors did not present physical proof showing he fired the gun. Instead, the case rested almost completely on eyewitness testimony. At trial in 1991, several people said they saw Troy Davis near the scene or believed he was the shooter. Based on those statements, the jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. Troy Davis took the stand in his own defense and said he did not kill Officer McPhail. He said he was nearby but unarmed and not involved in the shooting. The jury still convicted him. As years passed, major problems with the witness testimony began to surface. 7 of the 9 key prosecution witnesses later changed their stories or backed away from what they said at trial. Some said police pressured them during questioning. Some said they were scared. Others said they were unsure of what they actually saw that night. These changes did not happen all at once, but over time, and they raised serious concerns about the reliability of the original verdict. At the same time, new witnesses came forward. Several signed sworn statements saying that another man, Sylvester "Red" Coles, had admitted to being the shooter. Coles was present at the scene and was one of the original witnesses against Troy Davis. Despite these new statements, prosecutors argued that the claims were not strong enough to overturn the conviction. Courts agreed and did not grant a new trial. Troy Davis spent more than 20 years on death row. During that time, his case drew attention far beyond Georgia. Legal experts, religious leaders, and human rights groups reviewed the record and said the doubts were too serious to ignore. Pope Benedict XVI publicly asked for mercy. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter spoke out. Archbishop Desmond Tutu called the execution a moral failure. Around the world, nearly 1 million people signed petitions asking Georgia to stop the execution and allow deeper review. In 2009, something rare happened. The U.S. Supreme Court ordered a special evidentiary hearing, instructing a federal judge to review new witness statements and determine whether Troy Davis could prove his innocence. The hearing took place in 2010 before Judge William Moore. After reviewing the evidence, the judge ruled that Davis had not met the very high legal standard required to overturn his conviction, even while acknowledging lingering questions. With no legal options left, the execution moved forward. On the night of September 21, 2011, Troy Davis was put to death by lethal injection at a Georgia prison. Outside, crowds gathered in silence, prayer, and protest. Inside, Troy Davis used his final words to repeat his claim of innocence and to speak to the family of Officer McPhail with respect and sorrow. The execution did not bring peace to everyone. A man had been executed even though there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and even though most witnesses had later changed their stories. Once his life was taken, no court ruling could ever change that outcome. Case 9. Larry Griffin, a man from St. Louis, Missouri, who was executed while still saying he did not commit the crime. From the day police arrested him until his final moments, Larry Griffin repeated the same message. He was innocent. The crime happened in April 1980. A man named Christopher Davis, who was known to sell drugs, was shot and killed in St. Louis. Police began looking for suspects, but the investigation did not uncover physical proof linking anyone directly to the shooting. There was no weapon tied to Larry Griffin. There were no fingerprints. There was no forensic evidence placing him at the scene. Still, police arrested Larry Griffin, and prosecutors charged him with murder. At trial in 1981, the case against Larry Griffin depended almost completely on witness statements. Several people testified that Griffin was involved in the shooting. These witnesses were not strangers to the criminal system. Some had their own legal problems. Some were facing charges or hoping for help from police. The jury did not hear all of this information. Important details about the witnesses were not fully shared with Griffin's defense team. Even with these gaps, the jury found Larry Griffin guilty. He was sentenced to death. Larry Griffin immediately said the verdict was wrong. He told his lawyers he was not present when the shooting happened. He said the witnesses were lying. As the years passed, his legal team worked to uncover what really happened during the investigation. They found evidence that some witnesses had changed their stories over time. They found signs that police pressure may have played a role in what witnesses said. One key witness later admitted that parts of his testimony were not true. Another major issue involved the actions of prosecutors. Courts later acknowledged that prosecutors failed to turn over information that could have helped the defense question the credibility of the witnesses. This included details about deals, pressure, or benefits given to people who testified. Under the law, prosecutors are required to share such information. While courts later recognized that mistakes were made, judges ruled that these problems were discovered too late to stop the execution. Throughout his years on death row, Larry Griffin continued to speak clearly about his innocence. He filed appeals. He asked for hearings. He told anyone who would listen that he did not kill Christopher Davis. His claims were consistent. They did not change over time. Still, the courts denied his final appeals. Missouri set an execution date. On June 6, 1995, the state of Missouri carried out the death sentence. Larry Griffin was executed by lethal injection. Witnesses reported that he maintained his innocence until the end. He did not confess. He did not apologize for a crime he said he did not commit. His death closed the legal case, but it did not end the questions. After the execution, journalists, lawyers, and innocence advocates took a closer look at the evidence. News outlets, including ABC7, reported on the troubling details that came to light after Griffin's death. Legal experts pointed out that the case rested on testimony that was unreliable. They highlighted how withheld information could have changed the outcome if the jury had known the full truth. Innocence organizations cited Larry Griffin's case as an example of how the death penalty can move forward even when serious doubt exists. Larry Griffin was never legally cleared of the crime. Courts did not issue an exoneration. That fact matters. But it is equally important that courts acknowledge serious problems with how the case was handled. The lack of physical evidence, the reliance on questionable witnesses, and the failure to share critical information all remain part of the public record. Case 10. Ivan Abner Cantu said until his final minutes that he did not kill anyone. He was 50 years old when he died. Ivan Cantu was put to death for a double murder that happened on November 4, 2000 in Dallas, Texas. From the first day of his arrest to the night of his execution, he repeated the same message. He said the wrong person was being punished. The victims in the case were James Mosqueda, who was 27 years old, and Amy Kitchen, who was 22 years old. They were found shot inside their home. Police quickly began investigating and soon focused on Ivan Cantu, who knew the victims. Prosecutors said he took part in the crime. Ivan Cantu said this was not true. He said he was not at the home when the killings happened and said the story told at trial was wrong. Even with his denials, he was arrested and later brought to court. Ivan Cantu was tried and convicted in 2001. The case against him relied heavily on testimony from other people, not strong physical proof that clearly placed him at the scene. Over time, concerns grew about the reliability of this testimony. Supporters said some witnesses had reasons to shift blame away from themselves. They also said the jury never heard important information that could have changed how the evidence was understood. Despite these concerns, the jury found Ivan Cantu guilty and sentenced him to death. After his conviction, Ivan Cantu entered the long appeals process. He spent more than 20 years on death row, asking courts to review his case again. His lawyers said his original trial had serious problems. They argued that new evidence had come forward and that key testimony should be questioned. They also said the courts should allow a hearing to review this information. Each time, higher courts refused. Judges ruled that the legal process had already run its course, even as doubts continued to grow outside the courtroom. As the years passed, Ivan Cantu's case drew attention from watchdog groups, legal experts, and death penalty critics. Organizations focused on fairness in the justice system pointed to his case as one that deserved another look. Celebrities and public figures also spoke out, asking Texas officials to stop the execution and allow the new evidence to be heard. One of the most striking developments came when some jurors from the original trial later said they had doubts. They said they were troubled by what they learned after the verdict and felt they had not been given the full picture during the trial. In the final weeks before his execution, Ivan Cantu's legal team made last efforts to stop the sentence. They again asked the courts to review the new evidence and the concerns raised by jurors and experts. These requests were denied. Texas officials moved forward with the execution. As the date approached, public discussion intensified, with many people saying the risk of executing an innocent person was too great. On February 28, 2024, Ivan Cantu was taken to the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He chose lethal injection as the method of execution. In his final statement, he once again said he did not commit the murders. He said the truth had never fully come out. Witnesses reported that he remained calm as he spoke. Shortly after, the execution was carried out. Case 11. Roger Keith Coleman's name became one of the most famous in death penalty history. He was executed by the state of Virginia after being convicted of the rape and murder of his sister-in-law, Wanda McCoy. From the moment he was arrested until the final hours of his life, Roger Keith Coleman said he did not commit the crime. His case drew worldwide attention, sparked public protests, and became a powerful symbol of doubt about executions, only for science years later to tell a very different story. The crime took place in March 1981 in Grundy, a small town in southwestern Virginia. Wanda McCoy, a young mother, was found dead in her home after being brutally attacked. The crime shocked the community. Police quickly focused on Roger Keith Coleman, who lived nearby and had a troubled past. Investigators believed evidence pointed toward him, and he was arrested and charged. At trial, prosecutors presented biological evidence, witness testimony, and circumstantial details they said placed Coleman at the scene. A jury convicted him, and he was sentenced to death. From the start, Roger Keith Coleman denied guilt. He said he was being blamed because of his background and past behavior, not because of solid proof. As his appeals moved through the courts, his claims of innocence grew louder. Supporters argued that the forensic testing available in the early 1980s was limited and could not fully prove who committed the crime. They said doubt remained. and doubt should matter when a life was at stake. By the early 1990s, Coleman's case exploded into the national spotlight. In 1992, just days before his scheduled execution, Time magazine put his face on its cover. The headline was bold and alarming. "This man might be innocent. This man is due to die." The image traveled across the world. Religious leaders, activists, celebrities, and ordinary citizens pleaded with Virginia to stop the execution. Phone calls flooded the governor's office. Letters poured in from around the globe. Coleman gave interviews from death row, repeating his claim that the state was about to execute an innocent man. Despite the pressure, Virginia did not halt the execution. Courts ruled that the conviction and sentence should stand. Clemency was denied. On May 20, 1992, Roger Keith Coleman was executed in Virginia's electric chair. He died still saying he did not kill Wanda McCoy. His death left behind deep emotional scars and lasting doubt for many who believed a grave mistake had been made. For years after the execution, Roger Keith Coleman's name was used in arguments against the death penalty. To many people, he represented the fear that an innocent person could be put to death while the truth remained hidden. His case was cited in books, documentaries, and debates as an example of how the justice system could fail under pressure, limited science, and human error. But the story did not end there. In 2006, more than a decade after Coleman's execution, preserved evidence from the crime was tested using modern DNA technology. This type of testing did not exist at the time of his trial. The results were clear and direct. The DNA matched Roger Keith Coleman and ruled out other possible suspects. The testing confirmed that he was guilty of the crime for which he had been executed. This discovery changed how the case was understood. Roger Keith Coleman became one of the most important examples of how powerful innocence claims can later be proven false by science. His case now holds a different place in death penalty history. It shows that public belief, media attention, and emotional certainty are not the same as factual truth. It also shows the power of DNA testing to reveal answers that once seemed impossible to reach. Case 12. Leonel Herrera. From the first day of his arrest to the last words he spoke before his execution, Leonel Herrera said the same thing again and again. He said the wrong person was being punished. The case began in September 1981 in South Texas near Corpus Christi. Two police officers, Officer Enrique Carrizales and Officer David Rucker, were killed during a traffic stop. The shootings shocked the community and led to a fast and intense investigation. Leonel Herrera was later arrested and charged with the murders. From the start, he denied being the shooter. He said he did not kill the officers. He said his older brother, Raul Herrera, was responsible. Raul Herrera had already died before Leonel's trial, which meant he could not speak for himself in court. Leonel Herrera was tried and convicted in 1982. The case against him relied mainly on witness testimony. There was no physical proof that clearly showed Leonel Herrera fired the gun. There were no fingerprints, no weapon found in his hands, and no clear forensic evidence placing him at the moment of the shootings. Despite this, the jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. Years passed, and Leonel Herrera remained on death row. During this time, new evidence came forward. Several people signed sworn statements, saying that Raul Herrera had admitted to killing the officers. These were not rumors. They were formal statements given under oath. The new evidence directly pointed to another person as the shooter. Leonel Herrera's lawyers argued that this information was powerful and deserved a full hearing in court. They said the execution should be stopped until the truth could be properly examined. Texas courts refused to reopen the case. Judges said the legal process had already been completed. They ruled that the new evidence was not enough to overturn the conviction. Leonel Herrera's legal team took the case to the United States Supreme Court. In 1993, the court agreed to hear it. The Supreme Court's decision shocked many people. The court ruled that claims of innocence based on new evidence by themselves were not enough to stop an execution after all appeals had ended. The ruling meant that a person could be executed even if serious doubts remained, as long as the trial process had followed legal rules. One justice strongly disagreed. Justice Harry Blackmun wrote a powerful dissent. He said that executing a person who may be innocent would violate the United States Constitution. His words became famous and are still quoted today in discussions about fairness and the death penalty. Justice Blackmun warned that the justice system must never allow a person to be put to death if the truth has not been fully heard. As Leonel Herrera's execution date drew closer, he continued to say he was innocent. He asked for mercy. His supporters asked Texas officials to stop the execution and allow the new evidence to be reviewed. None of these efforts succeeded. The state moved forward with the sentence. On May 12, 1993, Leonel Herrera was executed by lethal injection. He was 45 years old. In his final statement, he again said he did not kill the officers. He said the truth had never been fully examined. Shortly after, the execution was carried out. After his death, Leonel Herrera's case did not disappear. It became a landmark example used in law schools, courtrooms, and public debates. Case 13. Carlos Santana was a man Texas executed for his role in a deadly armored car robbery, even as questions remained about what he actually did during the crime. From his conviction through his final days on death row, Carlos Santana continued to challenge the way the state described his guilt. He did not deny being present during the robbery, but he disputed that he was the person who fired the fatal shot. The crime that led to Carlos Santana's death sentence happened in 1981 during an attempted robbery of a Purolator armored vehicle in Texas. During the robbery, a security guard named Oliver Flores was shot and killed. Carlos Santana and another man, James Means, were arrested soon after. Prosecutors charged both men with capital murder. At trial, the state argued that Santana was one of the armed robbers involved in the attack and should be held fully responsible for the killing, even though it was never clearly shown which man fired the fatal shot. The case against Carlos Santana relied strongly on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. Witnesses described seeing two armed men during the robbery, hearing gunfire, and watching the men flee. However, no witness could clearly say who pulled the trigger that killed Oliver Flores. No physical or scientific evidence directly proved Santana fired the shot. The murder weapon was not conclusively tied to him. Even so, under Texas law at the time, participation in a violent felony that resulted in death could still lead to a death sentence. Carlos Santana's defense argued that the state had not proven his specific role in the killing. His lawyers raised concerns about how much weight was placed on witness accounts given under stress and confusion. They also argued that the jury was asked to assume Santana's intent rather than being shown clear proof. Despite these arguments, the jury convicted Carlos Santana of capital murder. He was sentenced to death while his co-defendant, James Means, also received a death sentence in a separate proceeding. While on death row, Carlos Santana continued to contest the state's version of events. He maintained that the evidence did not prove he was the shooter and that the punishment did not match the uncertainty in the case. His appeals focused on legal issues such as responsibility, fairness in sentencing, and whether the trial properly separated participation in a robbery from committing a murder. These appeals moved through the courts and were denied. Federal courts declined to intervene, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to stop the execution. Carlos Santana was executed by lethal injection in March 1993. Reports from the time describe him as calm in his final moments. He spoke to witnesses and maintained that the state had gone too far in punishing him for a crime where his exact actions were never fully proven. His execution took place years before widespread DNA testing became common in courtrooms, and no new scientific evidence emerged after his death to re-examine the case. In the years since, Carlos Santana's case has been discussed by death penalty critics as an example of how capital punishment can move forward even when uncertainty exists about key facts. Critics point out that when witness testimony is the main support for a death sentence, mistakes can carry the highest cost. Supporters of the conviction argue that Santana's involvement in a deadly robbery justified the outcome under the law. Courts have never overturned his conviction, and no official ruling has declared him innocent. Case 14. Dale Devon Chionette never said the robbery did not happen. What he said from the start and until the end of his life was that he was not the person who fired the gun and that he did not plan for anyone to die. Even as his execution date approached, he kept saying that the punishment did not match what he actually did. Dale Devon Chionette was convicted for the 1996 killing of Phyllis Phillips in Plano, Texas. Phyllis Phillips was a 29-year-old woman who was shot during a robbery at her apartment complex. The crime shocked the area and led to a fast police response. Investigators said multiple people were involved in the robbery. Prosecutors later charged Chionette and argued that he played a leading role in what happened that night. At trial, Dale Devon Chionette admitted something important. He said he took part in the robbery. He did not deny being present. What he denied was being the shooter. He said another person pulled the trigger. He also said he did not expect anyone to be hurt or killed. His defense focused on this difference. They said the state was treating him as if he were the gunman, even though there was no proof that he fired the weapon. Under Texas law, a person can be sentenced to death even if they did not kill the victim themselves. Prosecutors must convince a jury that the person helped plan a crime and should have known that a death could happen. In Chionette's case, the state argued that he met this rule. They said his role in the robbery made him responsible for the killing, even if someone else pulled the trigger. The jury accepted this argument and sentenced him to death. Dale Devon Chionette spent years on death row. During that time, he filed many appeals. His appeals did not say he was innocent of all wrongdoing. They focused on intent, fairness, and proportion. His lawyers argued that the evidence did not show he expected a killing. They said the jury was asked to guess what was in his mind rather than rely on clear proof. Chionette repeated the same message again and again. He said he was guilty of robbery, not murder, in the way the state described it. As the years passed, the courts rejected his appeals. Judges ruled that the jury had followed Texas law and that the sentence could stand. No court accepted the argument that his role was too small for the death penalty. His execution date was set for September 25, 2009. At that point, there were no legal paths left to stop it. On the day of his execution, Dale Devon Chionette was 35 years old. He was put to death by lethal injection. In his final statements, he continued to dispute the most important part of the state's case. He said he did not kill Phyllis Phillips. He said he did not plan for her to die. He said the state was ending his life based on a version of events that was not true. After his execution, his case continued to be discussed by legal experts and death penalty critics. Some people asked whether the death penalty should apply to someone who did not fire the weapon. Others questioned whether juries fully understand how responsibility is defined in these cases. Case 15. James Dupree Henry. From the time of his arrest until his final moments, James Dupree Henry maintained that he was innocent. He said the case against him was built mainly on a confession he did not freely give. His story became part of a larger conversation about death row prisoners who continued to deny guilt even as execution approached. The crime linked to James Dupree Henry happened in 1974 in Florida. A man was killed during a violent incident, and police began searching for a suspect. Investigators focused on Henry and brought him in for questioning. During this time, police said Henry confessed to the murder. That confession became the backbone of the case. There was limited physical evidence tying him directly to the crime scene. No strong forensic proof placed him there. Still, the confession carried great weight and shaped everything that followed. James Dupree Henry later told a very different story about that confession. He said it was not given freely. He said he was questioned for long periods and felt pressured to say things that were not true. According to Henry, fear and exhaustion played a role in what he told police. His defense argued that a confession made under such conditions should not be trusted. They warned the court that relying so heavily on a disputed statement created a serious risk of error. Despite these arguments, Henry was convicted and sentenced to death. The courts accepted the confession as valid evidence. Over the years, Henry continued to challenge his conviction. He filed appeals and asked judges to take another look at how his confession was obtained. His lawyers argued that the confession should have been excluded or given less importance. They said the case showed how easily a person could be condemned when a confession becomes the center of the story. As time passed, James Dupree Henry remained on death row. His position never changed. He continued to say he did not commit the murder. He did not confess again. He did not admit guilt later in life. His claims stayed the same from beginning to end. Courts reviewed his appeals but refused to overturn the conviction. Each ruling moved him closer to execution. In 1984, Florida set an execution date. Supporters argued that doubt still surrounded the case. They pointed to the lack of strong physical evidence and the heavy reliance on a confession Henry said was forced. Critics of the death penalty highlighted his case as an example of how final punishment can move forward even when questions remain unanswered. Still, the legal process continued without interruption. On September 20, 1984, James Dupree Henry was executed in Florida by electrocution. Witnesses reported that he maintained his innocence to the end. He did not change his story. He did not accept responsibility for the crime. His execution closed the legal case but did not erase the concerns raised over the years. After his death, Henry's case continued to be discussed in legal and historical studies of capital punishment. Researchers and advocates examined how confessions were obtained during the 1970s and early 1980s. Many cases from that period showed similar patterns, where statements made during intense questioning became the strongest evidence at trial. James Dupree Henry's story fits squarely within that history. James Dupree Henry was never legally cleared of the crime. Courts did not overturn his conviction. No new testing after his execution officially proved his innocence or guilt beyond what was already decided. What remains certain is that his conviction relied heavily on a confession he consistently said was not voluntary. Case 16. Willie Jasper Darden spent 14 years on death row, repeating the same claim every year he was there. Willie Darden said the justice system had made a terrible mistake. His case later became one of the most discussed examples of a death row prisoner who maintained innocence until execution. The case began in September 1973 in Lakeland, Florida. A robbery took place at a furniture store. During the crime, the store owner, Carl Schofield, was shot and later died from his injuries. Another man inside the store was also shot but survived. Police quickly searched for a suspect. Willie Darden was arrested and charged with murder. From the moment he was taken into custody, he said he was not the shooter and said he had nothing to do with the crime. At trial, the case against Willie Darden depended mostly on eyewitness identification. There was no physical evidence that directly placed him at the scene. No fingerprints linked him to the crime. No weapon tied to him was recovered. Prosecutors relied heavily on the surviving victim's identification. Over time, serious questions were raised about how that identification was made. Legal experts later said the process used to identify Darden was suggestive and could have influenced the witness's memory. There were also concerns about how evidence was presented to the jury. Some forensic claims were described in a way that made them sound stronger than they truly were. Years later, experts said this may have given jurors a sense of certainty that the evidence did not fully support. Even with these problems, Willie Darden was found guilty and sentenced to death. Willie Darden entered Florida's death row system in the mid-1970s. Life there was strict and isolating. During his 14 years on death row, he filed many appeals. His lawyers argued that his trial was unfair. They pointed to weak evidence, unreliable witness testimony, and serious legal errors. One major appeal reached the United States Supreme Court in 1986. The court reviewed whether the prosecutor's statements during trial were improper and harmful. While the court acknowledged troubling behavior, it still allowed the conviction and death sentence to stand. Outside the courtroom, concern about Willie Darden's case continued to grow. Legal scholars, religious leaders, and human rights groups said the evidence used to convict him was not strong enough to justify a death sentence. Organizations such as Amnesty International raised alarms, saying there was a real risk that an innocent man could be executed. They pointed out that eyewitness misidentification was a leading cause of wrongful convictions across the country. Despite these warnings, Florida courts denied every request for a new trial. Judges ruled that the legal process had already been completed. Willie Darden continued to say he was innocent. He never changed his story. He said the truth had never been fully examined and said the system refused to listen. As the execution date approached, public attention increased. Protests were held. Appeals for mercy were sent to Florida officials. Many people asked the governor to stop the execution and allow the case to be reviewed again. Those requests were denied. The state moved forward with the sentence. On March 15, 1988, Willie Jasper Darden was taken to Florida's execution chamber. He was 42 years old. He was executed in the electric chair. In his final statement, he again said he did not kill anyone. He said he was being put to death for a crime he did not commit. Witnesses reported that he spoke calmly and clearly. Case 17. Robert Pruitt continued to say that he did not commit the crime that sent him to death row. He was executed after being convicted in 2002 of killing a prison guard while already serving a sentence behind bars. From the day he was charged until his final hours, Robert Pruitt said the same thing. He did not stab the officer, and the state had blamed the wrong person. His execution went forward anyway, ending his life while his claims of innocence remained unresolved. The case began in 1999 inside the McConnell Unit, a Texas prison in Beeville. During an incident involving inmates, Daniel Nagel, a correctional officer, was stabbed and later died from his injuries. The prison was locked down. Investigators began questioning inmates who had been nearby. Prosecutors later accused Robert Pruitt of committing the stabbing. Pruitt denied this and said another inmate carried out the attack. No video footage clearly showed who stabbed Officer Nagel. There was also no physical evidence, such as DNA or fingerprints, that directly tied the weapon to Robert Pruitt. The case instead depended mostly on what other inmates said they saw or heard. In 2002, Robert Pruitt went on trial for capital murder. The jury heard testimony from prison witnesses, many of whom were also incarcerated and facing their own legal problems. Pruitt's defense argued that these witnesses were not reliable and that fear and pressure inside prison walls could affect what people say. The defense also pointed out that no clear proof showed Pruitt was the person who stabbed Officer Nagel. Despite these arguments, the jury accepted the prosecution's case. Robert Pruitt was convicted and sentenced to death. After his conviction, Robert Pruitt spent years on death row. During that time, he continued to say he was innocent. His lawyers filed appeals in state and federal courts. These appeals raised concerns about the strength of the evidence and the heavy reliance on inmate testimony. They argued that the case did not meet the standard needed for a death sentence. Courts reviewed the claims but denied relief. Each ruling kept the conviction and sentence in place. Clemency requests were also submitted, asking for mercy or a sentence change. Those requests were denied as well. As the execution date approached, attention returned to Robert Pruitt's case. News outlets reported on his long history of denying responsibility for the killing. ABC7 New York, along with other media organizations, covered his final appeals and last statements. Pruitt said he did not kill Officer Nagel and that the truth had been missed. Supporters pointed to the lack of physical evidence and the prison setting, where testimony can be influenced by fear, favors, or pressure. The state responded that the jury had heard the evidence and reached its decision. On the evening of October 12, 2017, Robert Pruitt was executed by lethal injection. He spoke to his family and those watching from behind the glass. He continued to deny killing the officer. Once the execution was carried out, all legal proceedings ended. There was no chance for further review. There was no way to reopen the case, even if new questions were raised later. Case 18. Richard Masterson. From the time of his arrest until the day he was executed, Richard Masterson said he did not commit the crime he was convicted of. He said the evidence used against him was wrong in key ways. He said important facts were misunderstood. Even when all appeals were gone, he kept saying the same thing. He said he was innocent. Richard Masterson was convicted in 2002 in Harris County, Texas, for the deaths of 4 members of one family. The case was deeply disturbing because it involved multiple victims inside a home. Prosecutors said Masterson was responsible for the killings and presented a case that included statements, witness accounts, and medical findings. A jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. From that moment on, his life moved inside the Texas prison system as he waited for execution. From the beginning, Richard Masterson denied killing anyone. He said the state's version of what happened did not match the truth. His lawyers argued that the case relied heavily on questionable forensic conclusions, especially testimony about how the victims died. They said the medical findings used at trial were flawed and based on outdated or unreliable methods. These concerns became central to Masterson's appeals. One of the most important issues raised after his conviction involved the medical examiner's testimony. Masterson's legal team argued that the expert who testified at trial had a history of providing unreliable opinions in other cases. They said later reviews showed that some of the conclusions about cause of death were not supported by strong science. According to these claims, if the medical evidence had been properly evaluated, the jury may have viewed the case very differently. Richard Masterson also challenged statements that prosecutors said showed guilt. His lawyers argued that some of these statements were made when he was under extreme stress and not in a clear state of mind. They said this raised doubts about how reliable those statements really were. Masterson himself said the state had taken pieces of information and shaped them into a story that was not true. Over the years, Richard Masterson filed many appeals in state and federal courts. These appeals raised the same core issues again and again. They focused on flawed forensic evidence, unreliable expert testimony, and the claim that the deaths may not have occurred in the way the prosecution described. His lawyers asked the courts to take a closer look at the science behind the conviction. Each time, the courts rejected the appeals. As time passed, Masterson's execution date moved closer. Advocacy groups and legal experts pointed to his case as an example of why forensic evidence must be carefully tested and reviewed. Some argued that the jury in 2002 did not have access to better scientific understanding that developed later. Others said the system moved too slowly to correct possible errors. Despite these arguments, Texas moved forward. Richard Masterson was executed by lethal injection in January 2016. He was over 50 years old at the time of his death. In his final statements, he maintained his innocence. He said he did not kill the victims. He said the state was ending his life based on evidence that should never have been trusted. After his execution, Richard Masterson's case continued to be discussed by death penalty critics and legal scholars. His name appeared in reports that examined executions carried out despite serious questions about guilt. These reports did not say a court had cleared him. They said something different. They said the case raised unresolved doubts that would never be answered because the execution had already happened. Case 19. Brian Keith Terrell was executed while continuing to insist that he did not commit the crime he was condemned for. From the start of his case through his final day, Brian Keith Terrell said he was innocent. His execution came more than 23 years after the crime, following repeated trials, appeals, and last-minute pleas that were all denied. The case began on June 22, 1992, in Jones County, Georgia. John Watson, a 70-year-old man and a close friend of Terrell's mother, was found dead in his home. He had been beaten and shot. The crime shocked the local community because Watson was known as a quiet and trusted man. Investigators focused on Brian Keith Terrell, who was in his early 20s at the time and had been acquainted with the victim. Prosecutors claimed Terrell had stolen checks from Watson and killed him to cover up the theft. From the beginning, the case against Terrell was not simple. His first trial ended in a mistrial because the jury could not agree on a verdict. At a second trial, he was convicted and sentenced to death, but that conviction was later overturned on appeal due to legal errors. A third trial finally resulted in the conviction that led to his execution. This long legal path showed how uncertain the case was. Even within the court system, Brian Keith Terrell and his lawyers consistently pointed to major problems with the evidence. There was no physical evidence that clearly placed him at the crime scene. Investigators collected 13 fingerprints from inside John Watson's home, and none of them matched Terrell. Footprint evidence found at the scene also raised questions, as defense lawyers said the prints did not match his shoe size. Despite these issues, prosecutors relied heavily on witness testimony to support their case. One of the most important witnesses was Terrell's cousin, who testified against him. Defense lawyers argued that this testimony was unreliable and given in exchange for a lighter sentence. Over time, concerns grew about whether the jury had heard a full and fair picture of the facts. Terrell's legal team said the prosecution used misleading statements and failed to correct false impressions during trial. They argued that these problems mattered deeply in a case where the punishment was death. Brian Keith Terrell maintained his innocence throughout his years on death row. He did not confess. He did not accept the state's version of events. His lawyers continued to file appeals, saying the case showed clear signs of unfairness. Groups such as the Equal Justice Initiative supported his claims and asked Georgia to stop the execution. They argued that executing a man without solid physical evidence created a serious risk of error. In the final weeks before his execution, Terrell sought clemency from the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles. The board reviewed the case and denied his request. Appeals were sent to state and federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, asking for more time to review the evidence. Every request was rejected. The execution date remained in place. On the night of December 9, 2015, Brian Keith Terrell was executed by lethal injection. Reports stated that he did not make a final spoken statement. Witnesses said he appeared to shake his head as the process began. Outside the prison, people gathered to protest and pray. Some believed justice was being carried out. Others believed the state was making a grave mistake. Case 20. Lester Bauer spent more than 30 years on death row. From the day he was charged until the day he died, Lester Bauer said he did not commit the crime. He told courts, lawyers, and reporters that he was innocent and that the case against him was built on indirect proof, not clear facts. His execution ended one of the longest death row cases in Texas history, but it did not end the questions surrounding his guilt. The case began in October 1983 in Montgomery County, Texas. 4 men were found shot to death inside an airplane hangar at an airfield. The victims were involved in aviation activities, and the crime shocked the area because of its violence and planning. Police arrived to find no witnesses who had seen the shootings happen. There was no clear suspect at first, and the investigation relied on piecing together movements, business links, and timing rather than direct observation. Investigators eventually focused on Lester Bauer. Prosecutors said he had business connections to one of the victims. Bauer admitted that he had purchased an ultralight aircraft from one of the men who later died. He never denied knowing the victim. However, he strongly denied being involved in the killings. He said the aircraft deal was his only connection and that he was not present when the 4 men were shot. There was no DNA evidence placing him at the scene. There was no confession. The case depended on circumstantial evidence, meaning the jury was asked to draw conclusions based on surrounding facts rather than direct proof. In 1984, a jury convicted Lester Bauer of capital murder and he was sentenced to death. From that moment forward, he said the jury had reached the wrong conclusion. As he sat on death row, he continued to repeat the same claim. He did not kill anyone. Over the years, his legal team reviewed the case again and again, searching for problems in how the trial was handled. One of the main arguments raised by Bauer's lawyers was that prosecutors failed to share certain evidence with the defense. They said some information could have helped support Bauer's innocence or weakened the prosecution's theory. These claims were brought before multiple courts over many years. Judges reviewed them carefully, but ruled that the conviction should remain in place. No court ever ruled that Bauer was wrongfully convicted, even though concerns about fairness were raised. As time passed, Lester Bauer grew older on death row. Decades went by. New governors came into office. Laws changed. Technology advanced. Still, his case remained unresolved in his favor. He continued to say the same thing in interviews and court filings. He did not commit the murders. He did not change his story. He did not admit guilt later in life. His position stayed the same for more than 3 decades. By the time Texas set his execution date, Lester Bauer had spent over 30 years waiting. His case became known as one of the longest death row stays in the state. Supporters argued that such a long delay showed how complex and uncertain the case was. Critics of the death penalty pointed to the lack of direct evidence and the unanswered questions. The courts, however, ruled that the legal process had run its course. On June 3, 2015, Texas executed by lethal injection. Lester Bauer was put to death while still saying he was innocent. He did not confess. He did not accept responsibility for the crime. His execution closed the legal file, but it did not erase the debates that had followed the case for decades. Case 21. Sedley Alley's case later became one of the most debated executions in Tennessee because, years after his death, the state's highest court admitted it had applied the law in his case the wrong way. The crime that led to Sedley Alley's conviction happened in July 1985 in Memphis, Tennessee. The victim was Suzanne Collins, a 19-year-old U.S. Marine. She was abducted, assaulted, and killed. The crime shocked the city and led to a fast and intense search for a suspect. Police focused on Sedley Alley, who lived nearby and had a prior criminal record. He was arrested and questioned by investigators. During police questioning, Sedley Alley gave a confession. That confession became the center of the prosecution's case. From the start, however, there were serious questions about how it was obtained. Alley later said he was confused, scared, and under extreme pressure during the interrogation. His lawyers said he had intellectual limitations and was highly suggestible. They argued that he told police what they wanted to hear, not what was true. After the confession, Alley said clearly and repeatedly that it was false. Sedley Alley went to trial and was convicted in 1987. He was sentenced to death. At trial, there was no modern DNA testing used to directly link him to the crime. The confession carried heavy weight with the jury. Alley told the court he was innocent and said the confession did not reflect what really happened. Even so, the jury found him guilty. He was sent to death row, where he would spend nearly 20 years. While on death row, Sedley Alley filed many appeals. He asked the courts to review his case again and again. A major part of his request was for DNA testing of evidence collected in the case. At the time of his trial, DNA testing was not available in the form used today. Alley's lawyers said that modern testing could help show whether he was guilty or innocent. Tennessee courts denied these requests, saying the law did not allow testing under the circumstances of his case. Sedley Alley continued to say he was innocent. He spoke to his lawyers, his family, and the media. His message never changed. As the years passed, new information began to raise more questions. Some evidence suggested that another man may have been involved in the crime. This possibility was never fully examined in court before Alley's execution. Despite these concerns, the state moved forward. On June 28, 2006, Sedley Alley was executed by lethal injection. He was 45 years old. In his final statement, he again said he did not kill Suzanne Collins. He said the truth had never been fully examined. Once the execution was carried out, many believed the case was closed forever. But the story did not end there. In 2011, 5 years after Sedley Alley's execution, the Tennessee Supreme Court made a striking admission. The court said it had misapplied Tennessee's post-conviction DNA testing law in earlier decisions. This included the legal reasoning used to deny DNA testing requests in cases like Sedley Alley's. In simple terms, the court admitted that the law had been interpreted the wrong way. This admission did not declare Sedley Alley innocent, but it confirmed something important. He may have been wrongly denied the chance to use DNA testing while he was still alive. By the time this mistake was acknowledged, it was too late to help him. After this admission, the Innocence Project stepped in. Acting on behalf of Sedley Alley's estate, the organization filed a petition asking for DNA testing of any remaining evidence. The goal was to find the truth, even after death. The request was based on evidence that had never been tested and on information suggesting another suspect may have committed the crime. The petition renewed public debate and brought national attention back to Alley's case. If you enjoyed watching this Death Row documentary, please subscribe to my channel. I create and post interesting true crime videos on the channel daily. Thank you for watching.